It is great to have you with us. It is EWTN's coverage of World Youth Day 2023 coming to you live from beautiful sunny Lisbon, the Portuguese capital, one of the oldest cities in Europe and an incredibly beautiful city, it has to be said. I'm joined by Dr. Matthew Bunsen and by Father Mark Mary Christina. We're in Eduardo Park, which is right next to Lisbon Airport, where the Holy Father touched down around 30 minutes ago or so, and now, as you can see on your screen, he is making his way to the presidential palace to meet the President and Prime Minister of Portugal. So they have the road closed off for him in one direction as he heads through the city, heading towards the city centre, and it's a beautiful sight to see here as we bring you these pictures live from the helicopter in the air. Matthew, how many popes have visited Portugal?
Well, in the modern era, four, in fact. Pope St. Paul VI, who came in 1967 for a brief visit, focused mainly on Fatima. And I know that Fatima is going to be assuming some importance over the next few days as Pope Francis is heading there. And then we had Pope St. John Paul II, who came here in particular in 1982 on basically the one-year anniversary of the failed assassination attempt on him in St. Peter's Square. And throughout
on the anniversary, 1 year exactly after
essentially a year after the assassination attempt, where he was unable to travel for a year because of the severity of his injuries. But he came to Portugal, in particular, again, to Fatima. Why? To give thanks to the Blessed Mother, because he always felt that her intercession had saved his life. And, of course, the momentous events of his pontificate that followed. He came back again, I think, in 1991, and then again in 2000 as part of the Jubilee, going once more. I think he sensed that this might be the last time he would be able to go to Fatima. Then we had Pope Benedict XVI, who came in 2010, and then Pope Francis in 2017 on that centenary, of Fatima, and now he's back.
And John Paul beautifully put the bullet into the crown of Our Lady. I think it's right in the top.
It is.
Yeah. So he obviously totus tuus. He was a great Marian Pope, wrote beautifully about her, and just an inspiration for us all about how to have a true Christocentric devotion to Our Lady that's healthy and strong.
Yeah.
And when you talk about security as well for the Pope, and what Pope John Paul II said, be not afraid, in the literal sense, just a year after the failed assassination attempt, he was putting out a strong statement. As soon as he was well and able enough, he was back out reaching people. And because the security threat would still have been high, of course, for Pope John Paul II then, but he still traveled and he continued.
I was struck by something he said. I read this in George Weigel's biography, but he said he learned to be a person of great trust it was here at Czestochowa, he said. You know, that bright mountain, this great Marian shrine. It's the spiritual heart of Poland. And I got to go there back in October, and I'd been to like different, even the Marian shrine in this country, Our Lady Good Help, they just renamed it, I forgot what they call it now. But I went there, and you felt the gentle presence of Our Lady. It was a real sweetness, comforting thing. Went to Czestochowa, and I remember I was praying the rosary, and it was a lot of people. It was during the week, but I felt the strength of Our Lady, because they always make these pilgrimages there. He is a bishop there, led pilgrimages, and you think about what the Polish people have suffered in their, the partitions and, Nazism and different wars and everything. They needed strength, right? And she provided it. I mean, you go there, you just have a sense of the strength of the Polish people.
But how striking is it that you attended it in Krakow, the World Youth Day. It was in 2016.
Right.
So to consider that here was John Paul, it is generally believed that the assassination attempt was orchestrated by the Soviet Union, by the KGB. It failed. He went on to play such a pivotal spiritual role, and in many ways even a cultural and political role in the ultimate fall of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Soviet Empire. And sure enough, a World Youth Day would eventually be held in Poland. Right. Something would have been unimaginable at the time of his election in 1978.
You're right. I didn't think of that, but yeah, that's beautiful.
And while we're talking about that awful assassination attempt in 1981, the beautiful story that came from that, it was a Turkish man, wasn't it?
Mehmet Ali Akça.
And how the Pope went to visit him in prison, heard his confession. And I believe that in 2005, when Pope John Paul II was gravely ill and passing away, that this man actually wrote from Turkey wishing the Pope well and, praying for his good health. Which
that's right.
Isn't that incredible?
Well, but it's a demonstration, too, of not just the holiness of John Paul II, but the Christian call to forgiveness, to reconciliation, and the impact that that can have. And we were talking earlier about the potential here for Pope Francis in speaking to Portugal about the sexual abuse crisis, but also the spiritual crisis that many in Portugal are feeling, not just in Portugal, though, that many in the West are feeling.
And not an easy thing to do, eh? Easier said than done, to forgive your enemies and to pray for your enemies as well. We're called to pray for our enemies. I mean, Father, again, to come back to that thing, because I'm just conscious viewers might have missed our conversation earlier, but about some of the awful crimes that have happened here in the Catholic Church in Portugal, very much in the media here because that report was released this year. How are Catholics called to comprehend this and compartmentalize it in their mind when they see such good being done by the Church, as we spoke about across Africa, but then they hear about the terrible crimes and sins that have taken place?
And it should be shocking. It should be shocking to all of us, but the evil that we're capable of. I remember Pope Francis gave one of the most beautiful addresses about the Holocaust when he went to Jerusalem, and he went to the Wailing Wall, I think it was, and he gave this meditation about Adam and Eve in the garden, and after the fall, God goes searching for them, calls out, "Adam, where are you?" is what the Scripture says. And Pope Francis added to that, "And what evil have you done?" And he's so eloquent, because he goes on to say, without the mercy of God, without his forgiveness, there's no limit to what we're capable of, right? So, not to ever to excuse evil, we need to fight against it. The Church needs to reform and have its structures in place to protect this from ever happening. But to realize that we're capable of tremendously wicked things. And, we need to be healed. We need to get together. I think it's good to have the sharing among the victims, the Pope to meet them, to try to bring some consolation to it. And that's what these last popes have been doing.
And so, Matthew, as we watch now the Pope travel through the streets of Lisbon and the young people cheering on from the side, this could be a moment of healing as well for many Catholics in Portugal and people who are feeling that disappointment and sadness.
That's absolutely right. We have seen in this pontificate, we saw the work begin in particular under John Paul II and then accelerate under Pope Benedict, but then Pope Francis really committed himself from the very beginning of his pontificate to deal effectively with the crisis, with the scourge of clergy sexual abuse. We have seen quite a few reforms, upholding those who are guilty accountable, including bishops who have failed in their task as shepherds, either committing these crimes and sins themselves or in covering up or just being negligent in dealing with it. So Pope Francis, I think, has a track record. But something that Father said, too, is important, and that is that in the Church, we have sinners. We have those who are capable of enormous evil, as we have seen. But the Church is also the place where you can find healing from that. And these reforms, this renewal, there's a great famous phrase from Pope St. Gregory I the Great, Semper Ecclesia Reformanda. The Church is always reforming and always renewing. And part of that is recapturing a sense of the sacred, of the reverent, of the Eucharist, of the sacraments, the sacrament of penance in particular. And Pope Francis, with his legislation, I think, has gone some distance in creating at least the structures for that. Now we have to have the will to commit to it.
For example, we have the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors in place, which does really great work in safeguarding and implementing safeguarding measures and policies across the world. But as, of course, so much done, but always more to do.
And in Ireland, what have you seen? Like the comeback there, has been a renewal, or?
I think the renewal we're still waiting to see happen. But I know there was so much hurt and pain in the Church in Ireland. And when we went there this year to record that piece for St. Patrick's Day about what happened to the Catholic faith in Ireland, it was once called the land of saints and scholars. And now maybe the scholars without the saints, I'm not sure. But with the lack of mass attendance, the abuse crisis, when it hit Europe, it hit Ireland so hard. And it seemed, from someone watching it in the media, it was endless, the stories that were coming out. And recently even stories of Holy Ghost Fathers in Dublin from Blackrock that hit the headlines. And so for young Catholics, of course, so difficult, especially if they're not strong in their faith anyway. And they're hearing these stories and they're not seeing the good of the Church, as we talked about. They're not being given the stories of the incredible work that the Church does. You can humanitarian work all over the world.
Yeah.
When they look at it, they don't have that strong faith or prayer life. Very difficult for them, you know.
You know, and one thing I've experienced when I was studying in the seminary and thing, and I was still kind of discerning the call of the priesthood. I remember when Mother Angelica was at EWTN, you know, a lot of groups would come, and we'd have a lot of priests with those groups. And I got to meet a lot of priests. I grew up in Alabama, not many Catholics. You just kind of knew your pastor, maybe one other guy. But when I met all those priests, I realized I really liked them. They were funny,
Yes.
affable, warm people. So I encourage people. Every priest got quirks, may have some rough edges, but there's a lot of goodness out there. I've been always impressed by, like, priests have different gifts and talents, abilities, and get to know your priest and let them minister to you.
Well, it's funny when I talk to some of my friends who maybe are not practicing Catholics, and they're saying, "Oh, but Colin, you know, why are you practicing Catholic? And I don't believe in the Catholic Church." And then I might tell them a story. "Oh, well, we went to South Africa and we made a program about Sister Ethel Normoyle, a nun who's been there for 50 years and through apartheid and helping the people who just are suffering so much in these townships." And they say, "Oh, well, that's incredible what she does, and that's unique." And I say, "Yeah, she is unique, but she's not unique, actually. You have sisters and priests and brothers like this all over the world doing it in the name of God and in the name of the Catholic Church."
Pope Francis uses the phrase of the unknown saints.
Yes.
Catholics and holy people all over the world who are going about their lives. Someday we may know about them. Carlo Acutis, it's a name that we hear a lot here at World Youth Day, of a young boy who died, who's beatified, who's on his way to canonization, who is a great role model for young people. That's sort of the unofficial patron saint in some ways of the internet for social media, because he was sort of a pioneer in that, in building a website about Eucharistic miracles.
But most of these people who do incredible work we will never hear of. They won't make the front of a magazine. They won't be on the TV shows anytime soon. I even look at my own family, who you met yesterday. My uncle James, Father James Flynn, this year he just celebrated 50 years of the priesthood as a Spiritan, and almost 30 of those years were spent in Luanda in Angola, West Africa, when it was very dangerous to be there. And earlier this year, my aunt, she passed away in Canada. She was a sister of service, Sister Patsy Flynn. They went to, now when you talk about rural parts of Canada, where no one else was going, to educate the people, to help a lot of prison ministry as well, she did. And again, you'll never hear that name. You know, and these are just hundreds of thousands all over the world, quiet people doing incredible saintly work.
Well, and Pope Francis, we're talking about his pontificate. He has been a great practitioner of penitential acts of healing and forgiveness, the call for healing and forgiveness.
And now we see Pope Francis just arriving at the presidential residence here in the middle of Lisbon. You can hear the crowds cheering in the background. Oh, and it looks like they're going to have this outdoors on the street because the weather allows it here in Lisbon. That's one of the, you can never do this in Ireland. I can tell you that. It'd be a washout with rain. That's why we have a beautiful, luscious green country.
The Palacio Nacional of Belém, essentially the residence of the President of Portugal, in this case Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa. The two exchanging greetings. I used the two words earlier, serene and cordial. I think we can describe this as certainly cordial.
And look at that. It's great seeing the Holy Father so happy, looking out at all the young people. He's in his element here, isn't he, Father Mark, with all the young people?
Yeah, he has a great quality of being spontaneous. And
prior, just before he left from Rome, he had a meeting with generations. And one of those themes that we've seen with Pope Francis is the generations need to be bridges to each other. And over the next few days, I think we're going to see that as a theme. He just had the celebration of the third day for the elderly and the grandparents. Well, he is, in many ways, a grandfatherly figure who's come here to World Youth Day. But first we have the diplomatic side. And here is the welcoming of the Holy Father, the supreme head of the Holy See of the Vatican City State, visiting Portugal.
And as the cannons are fired from that battleship on the water, that was the Portuguese national anthem we were hearing.
By tradition, it's called the Pontifical Anthem that is played for any time that the Holy Father is received in an official capacity, otherwise known as the Marche Pontificale.
EWTN's live coverage of the 37th World Youth Day. And today, Wednesday, August the 3rd, Pope Francis has arrived in Lisbon. He is now currently at the Presidential Palace. And what we're seeing here, Matthew, this is protocol, and now they will go in behind closed doors and they will have their meeting, of course.
It'll be a brief meeting. There will be an exchange of gifts. One of the gifts that's involved here is a commemorative medal of World Youth Day. Obviously a very fitting occasion to have that, and the primary reason for Pope Francis's visit. But every papal visit involves its own diplomatic protocol that we're seeing here. In this case, a military march. We're seeing elements of what I'm assuming are the Portuguese armed forces in procession. It's a more comfortable way for Pope Francis to see this procession, sitting, chatting with the President of the Republic of the country of Portugal, Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa.
When do we expect Pope Francis to make his first public address or public announcement?
Well, I think that's coming up very soon, unless there's a surprise here. I think what we really want to circle is the presentation with the speech he's going to be giving in probably an hour or so to the authorities here in Portugal. And that'll be, I believe, at the Cultural Center of Belém. It is also traditional for the Holy Father, we've seen this throughout all of the popes in the modern era, to speak to authorities, the political leaders, but then also, as we were talking earlier, cultural leaders, influencers, so to speak, to use the social media term, those who have an impact on secular culture here. So that's going to be sort of his first major word to the Portuguese people. And then we'll see his meeting at the Apostolic Nunciature, which is the Vatican embassy essentially to Portugal, where he will have an encounter or meeting with Prime Minister Antonio Costa, who's the socialist leader here. I think he's been in power since 2015. And what happens in that meeting is probably going to be subject to a telegram. We'll have some idea of what was spoken. And then he will go from there. It's a fairly short meeting based on the schedule. And then he will have vespers or prayer, evening prayer, with the cardinals, the bishops, priests, seminarians of Portugal here in Lisbon itself. And his words there, I think, are his first major word, his themes for the church in Portugal. So we've been seeing the Vatican flag flying extensively here. Well, there are two bands. There's the gold and the white. And the gold symbolizes traditionally the spiritual power. The white band symbolizes the temporal power. We're seeing displayed here today both of those aspects. And then laying over those is the crossed keys of the papal tiara, a reminder that this is the Pope who is the successor of St. Peter.
And I must mention, as we watch this here on the monitor, beautiful images coming from the air, coming from the ground. Our colleagues at RTP, the host broadcaster here, who we are working with in Portugal, doing a really brilliant job at televising this in a very beautiful way. So our thanks to them as well. Because, it's important we have to get the beauty across of this, and just all the angles, and it's no easy feat. And I know over the next few days, Matthew, the Pope will be he'll be hearing young people's confession, I believe that's tomorrow.
That's correct.
He'll be meeting some charity workers, people who work with those who have addiction problems and mental health issues.
I got a classic Francis thing.
Yes,
yeah.
He's choosing to go and meet those people here, affirm them in their work, and listen to them. Is it expected as well he's going to meet with abuse survivors, or he's going to address that?
Well, there has been an assumption for some time that Pope Francis would meet with the survivors. Such an encounter will likely take place, if it does, at the Apostolic Nunciature, which has also been sort of a pattern. It's what he did when he visited the United States. But we'll have to see about confirmation for that. Obviously, this is a very sensitive matter. But I would be surprised if some kind of a meeting with the abuse victims doesn't take place, just in the sense that, as we've been discussing, Pope Francis as a figure of reconciliation, of asking that forgiveness, of helping to bring healing to the victims. I think that's an important gesture. But I think we'll also see various comments from Pope Francis while he's here addressing that issue as well.
And as a matter of fact, Pope Francis will be here where we are tomorrow for the opening ceremony, which will take place on the huge stage behind us. You may hear intermittently in the audio them testing the speakers and loud music coming on. If you're wondering where that's coming from, please do not adjust your set, as they say. That's them testing the audio system here at the park where they had the opening mass yesterday. So Eduardo Park will be the location for the opening ceremony.
I think if we had energy last night with the opening mass, the welcoming ceremony for Pope Francis tomorrow night is going to be intense.
It is going to be incredible. And I encourage people as well, if you have access to YouTube and Facebook, to go back and watch some of the scenes from last night if you happen to miss them, because it just gives you so much hope and inspiration when you see the sheer amount of people that were here last night. It was really, really beautiful. Lovely shots now we're seeing from a drone over the ancient city of Lisbon, going back with a rich history, a rich Christian tradition and history way back under the Roman Empire. regained its Christian.
That's correct.
After the 12th century, was it, or something?
That's absolutely right. Well, in so Christianity arrived very early in the life of the Iberian Peninsula and was well established in what was called the Roman province of Lusitania. And Christianity was firmly planted here and next door in Spain and Hispania. Was flourishing, and then came the Arab invasions, the Moorish invasions in the 8th century, and it remained under Moorish control for a number of centuries until the very famous word here. Sometimes it's considered an ill-favored word now in some circles, called the Reconquista, in which the Iberian Peninsula essentially was freed from the domination of the Moors. And from that point on, Christianity was reestablished in a very firm way. Christianity had continued under the Moorish kingdoms, but from that point on, we can see a very strong Christian presence. Now, that doesn't mean that the church hasn't had issues over the centuries subsequent to that, with various governments that sought to oppress the church, even what we would consider to be a Catholic country. We see that elsewhere. We saw that with the French Revolution in France. We saw that in Mexico, so it's not unheard of. So the relationship between the church and the Portuguese governments have been at times fraught, at times very cordial.
And now we see Pope Francis meeting with the local bishops.
Yeah, I was reading some of the history about it, and I went to Castle Hill, where St. George's Castle is, and they had a Phoenician presence here, 1200 BC.
That's right.
That's pretty old. I mean, the Celtic tribes were here, the Greeks, the Carthaginians, the Romans, the Visigoths, the Moors, and the Reconquest happened from 711 to 1147, and the Second Crusade liberated the Iberian Peninsula. So,
well, and let's not forget that Portugal was one of the great centers for exploration.
Yes.
Around the world. Vasco da Gama, one prominent figure, is worth mentioning here. And ships set sail from these ports all along the Portuguese coast into what was an unknown...
The final frontier back
right,
then, yes.
Exactly.
What journeys of exploration and adventure must have been unbelievable.
Yeah, he sailed around the southern tip of Africa and opened up India, brought back all these spices. You know, you read about that in the history book, and what are these precious spices? You know, it's like cinnamon, cardamom, ginger, pepper, nutmeg, stuff we have on our shelves, anise, clove, turmeric. But the important thing as well for the church is that missionaries joined in on these routes and was able to spread the faith. And, a lot of Portuguese colonies around the world. I mean, how many countries speak Portuguese today?
That's right.
Is it like 10, I think? 10
well, we think of a place like Brazil. We think of parts of India, Macau, for example. Mm-hmm. These were long-held colonies by Portugal until the 20th century.
Now we see that Pope Francis, the Pope is still remaining where he was, and this is the President who is now entering here.
I was in Brazil for World Youth Day, and I remember at the end that Sunday we went to the state park that overlooked the Atlantic. And I don't know, some reason I look at the Atlantic, I just think of all the European trade and everything, and how the missionaries, accompanied them and just spread the faith, with great generosity, and what an impact, on Western culture, civilization, to spread that. It was powerful.
So yes, that was the President entering the presidential palace after the short greeting outside with the Pope, and now we see Pope Francis in his typical small white car, who is making the slow and short journey inside the presidential palace for his private meeting with the Portuguese president.
And we'll have to see how much of the actual encounter or meeting between the two of them is broadcast. We will certainly have photos and film of the meeting between the two of them.
It's always interesting to see when they release the statement afterwards and they say about what the Pope and the President spoke about, the different themes and the issues. As you said, normally it's cordial and the shared interest of the environment.
That's right. In many ways, the meeting here between Pope Francis and the President is very honorific. It is almost symbolic because of the nature of the way that the government is structured here. As we were talking earlier, the role of President is a somewhat limited one constitutionally. The nitty-gritty, the really political discussion is going to take place later today with Prime Minister Antonio Costa, whose government is in control here. I believe they came to power in 2015 and recently won re-election.
Well, as we mentioned, just to remind you that the meeting is private, so we won't be televising the actual meeting here on EWTN, but we will have reaction to it in a few moments as we watch along with you at home those beautiful images from the air of the presidential palace here in Lisbon and Portugal, and we see the flag of the Holy See there waving in the crowd. This is EWTN. You're watching our live coverage of World Youth Day coming to you from Eduardo Park here in Lisbon. We have a quick break to take. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back. We are live here in Lisbon, EWTN's coverage of World Youth Day 2023. And it is, if you're just joining us, it has been such a brilliant time here so far. We had the opening mass last night right here in Eduardo Park with hundreds of thousands of young people. We don't have an official number yet, but when you see the images from the air, it was packed with hundreds of thousands of young people. And as Matthew pointed out earlier in the coverage, traditionally, we know from other World Youth Days, it is the final mass that sees the greatest swell in numbers. So if last night was anything to go by, we're in for a great week. And we'll have it all live for you, broadcast in lots of different languages here on EWTN. At the moment, we've been covering Pope Francis's arrival to Portugal, and he landed around an hour ago at the airport right beside us. He is in the presidential palace at the moment, meeting the president. As we mentioned, this is a private meeting. And we expect them to talk once again, Matthew, about any topics in particular, do you think?
Well, it's hard to say. As we've been discussing that the role of president is somewhat constitutionally limited here, so it's likely that the two of them will have a discussion about the culture, about what's happening at World Youth Day, and some of the pressing issues facing Portugal.
So it's his meeting with the Prime Minister that might be more substantial.
That's exactly right. Prime Minister Costa, that comes later this afternoon. Coming up soon, of course, is his meeting, and he'll be giving a presentation, a speech, to the leaders of the authorities of the government, civil leaders in society, and also the diplomatic corps here in Portugal. That will establish, I think, some of the themes that Pope Francis has in mind for the next few days.
Father, the duty of the Holy Father and the Church to speak out when it is coming to countries like Portugal, or any country for that matter, when often we see the teachings of the Catholic Church can be totally at odds with maybe policies in a country, what the popular trend is. What is the duty of the Church to try and express its view and be heard?
Yeah, it is.
Because it's a very delicate position they're in.
It is. They have to be pastoral, and sometimes we've seen popes speak strongly, like John Paul II would be in some country and really get animated, and remember Central America, he did that. I think it was El Salvador and things. And so, yeah, I give him a lot of leeway because those are very hard decisions, like you said. Plus, you have the Holy Spirit to inspire him. Sometimes you want to encourage what's good there. Sometimes you might want to challenge, have a very strong message. So keep your eye on the common good. What's the most effective way to do that? I think, like in the United States, sometimes when I preach, I focus a lot just like on natural law, because they're not going to listen to what the Bible has to say, right? So you have to make a reasonable case for why we have to protect the least among us, protect human dignity and things. But as we've been saying, it is such a vital role to give that message.
Well, a good example would be Pope John Paul II and his relationship with his native Poland. When he was elected Pope in 1978, Poland was under the thumb and the part of the Soviet Empire, of the Iron Curtain. And his visits there were prophetic, they were powerful, they were calling for political freedom, for the dignity of the human person. But after the fall of communism, John Paul went back to Poland in the early 1990s. And what was his message? It wasn't what everyone assumed to be a victory lap. He was warning them about what could come with the absence of the communism, and that would be relativism and secularism. And sure enough, that's been one of the great threats in the West. So popes over the decades, over the centuries, have been powerfully prophetic in warning culture. And unfortunately, culture very often doesn't listen to what the popes say to great cost.
We see now these live pictures coming to us from inside the presidential palace. Pope Francis signing, I presume, the guest book on his arrival as he is about to go in for his meeting, which we will bring you analysis of that, or what we get from the press release, in around half an hour. But at this stage in our coverage, We're going to take a break for half an hour or so here on EWTN. We will be back continuing with more of Pope Francis's first day in Lisbon for World Youth Day. But for the moment, from myself, from Matthew, from Father Mark, from all the team here in sunny Lisbon, it's goodbye for the moment, and we'll talk to you in around half an hour or so. Thank you for watching.